If you're watching this video, it's probably for some school assignment because you would rather watch a YouTube video than read your textbook. If not, and you're watching this for fun, some people might call you lame or say you have nothing better to do. But at least you can live secure in the notion that you're cooler than the person who spent hours to make this video. Anyway, here's a quick overview of the entire history of the United Nations. So, if you've already been through high school or are currently attending, I want you to think back for a second to those crowded cafeterias and oppressive halls. Remember those kids who always got A's in government class and wore business clothes every few weeks adorned with the name tags of countries? Yeah, those were the Model United Nations kids who actually spent their free time researching international issues and their Saturday debating on those issues. What they were doing was simulating the real United Nations, an international organization in which countries meet to debate and implement solutions to global issues. Boy, did you make a mistake going to prom instead of researching India's stance on gentrification and nuclear proliferation. Yeah, there's no way I was one of those kids. All jokes aside, though, the real United Nations, headquartered in New York City because of some blatant Americentrism, plays an extremely vital role in global problem-solving efforts. Since its inception, the various bodies of the United Nations have passed thousands of resolutions, formal texts adopted by multiple countries, to address international issues. The origins of the United Nations can be traced back to 1918. Woodrow Wilson was President of the United States, and World War I was approaching its conclusion. If we were really reaching back, we could technically say that the philosophy that inspired the United Nations could be traced all the way back to Immanuel Kant in the 1700s, but that sounds tiresome and extra, and you have a test tomorrow, so we're going to skip ahead. On January 8, 1918, President Wilson outlined before Congress his 14 points, a plan he created with a committee of experts known as the Inquiry, to secure peace between all nations and bring an end to the war. The first 13 points were recommendations of both a specific and general nature to avoid future conflict. However, the 14th point is the real relevant one, which basically called for the formation of a general association of nations to protect the political independence and territorial integrity of both large and small countries alike. The proposed organization became known as the League of Nations and was drafted as part of the Treaty of Versailles that marked the end of World War I in 1919. Ironically, though the League was initially President Wilson's idea, it never gained sufficient congressional support, and thus the United States never joined the League of Nations. Despite this, many other countries did join, and at its height, the League had 58 members. In its 26 years of existence, the League of Nations resolved a number of mainly territorial disputes between countries, but was nonetheless regarded as fairly ineffectual in the international community with its failures in disarmament and the advent of the Second World War. It was these events that prompted the Allied countries in World War II to form a more effectual international organization to replace the failing League of Nations. The tedious particulars of how this organization would run were hammered out through a long series of conferences and debates between representatives of dozens of countries, so we'll just cover the highlights. On June 12, 1941, representatives of various countries on the side of the Allies during World War II meet in the St. James Palace in London to sign a declaration reaffirming their commitment to stop German aggression and stating that the only true basis of enduring peace is the willing cooperation of free peoples. This meeting marked the first step towards creating the United Nations. Just over a month later, on August 14, 1941, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill meet to affirm their goals of cooperative and common principles of world peace in their Atlantic Charter. Side note, the Atlantic Charter is a prime example of something that sounds official but doesn't mean squat. Like, it wasn't a legally binding document, nor did it have any specific goals. It was about as technically effective as a charter you draw up with your friends when you're 12 concerning the rules of your treehouse. But that's politics for you. Half of government work is just reaffirming what you already agreed upon. Moving on to 1942, on January 1st and 2nd, representatives from 26 countries meet to craft the Declaration of the United Nations, which is based upon the principles of the Atlantic Charter, which is based upon the principles of the Declaration of St. James, which was based upon the principles of the League of Nations. Sensing a pattern here? The talk of kumbaya settles down for the next year or so. Can't imagine why, not like there was a world war or anything. Until October 30th of 1943, when the governments of the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, the United States, and China called for an early establishment of an international organization to maintain peace and security during what would become known as the Moscow Conference. The theme of the Moscow Conference was carried on just a month later on December 1st during the Tehran Conference, when the same four countries met to decide upon some of the technical details of how the United Nations would operate. More specifically, it was during this conference that the four nations agreed upon a four-nation Security Council within the United Nations to help ensure peace and avoid future conflicts. However, it wasn't until the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in October of 1944 that they worked out the structure of the United Nations, as well as each agree upon lending troops from their countries to the UN Security Council to enforce agreements and neutralize conflicts. Next up was the Yalta Conference on February 11, 1945, which didn't do much of anything except establish specific voting procedures for the Security Council, which sounds irrelevant, but is actually extremely important to how the UN operates, so we'll get back to that later. Also, they added France to the Security Council during this conference because, France. Lastly was the San Francisco Conference in June of 1945, during which hundreds of delegates representing 50 nations met to debate and eventually sign the Charter of the United Nations, which laid out the rules of how the UN would operate to this day. But, as is evident by the trail of conferences, government moved slowly, and the charter did not become official until it was approved by the various governing bodies of the countries that were signatories later in the same year. Side note, the League of Nations had its last session in 1946 to transfer its remaining assets to the UN, and it was during this session that Robert Cecil gave his final speech declaring, "The League is dead. Long live the United Nations." I'm not lying, those are his actual words verbatim, which makes it sound more like he just conquered a small island for the motherland rather than marked the beginning of a peace organization. So, what now? It's 1945, the United Nations is a thing. What did they do? Write poetry and hand daisies out to soldiers? Not exactly. Peace and cooperation between all nations sounds great, but negotiations can devolve quickly when countries have to compromise on issues they don't like. So the UN was created with very specific powers and structure to maintain diplomacy and effect change. As determined by the United Nations Charter, the UN is made up of 6 main bodies: General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council, International Court of Justice, and Secretariat. Let's go through quickly. General Assembly, or GA, is the main deliberative organ of the UN and has delegates from all 193 member states. They meet once a year for approximately a week in September in New York for the annual General Assembly session, where they discuss general issues, as well as budgetary and member matters, which require 2/3 majority vote. Security Council holds the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security and has the power to impose sanctions and authorize the use of force to restore peace and security. The Trusteeship Council was established in the UN Charter to supervise 11 trust territories in their development of self-governance. The last trust territory reached this point in 1994, so now the Council only meets at the request of the GA or Security Council rather than annually. The International Court of Justice settles disputes between countries. They're basically just the court for the entire world. That isn't meant to be reductive either. Being the court for the entire world sounds like a super difficult job. I wouldn't want it. Lastly, Secretariat is composed of the Secretary General and all the other thousands of staff members that do the daily work mandated by the various UN committees, from paperwork to peacekeeping. In addition to these 6 main organs, the UN has a number of other programs and agencies that carry out more specialized functions, which, to name a few, include the International Monetary Fund, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and the World Health Organization, which everyone kind of forgets about until there's an outbreak of a scary disease and everyone remembers that the work they do to contain outbreaks and maintain human health is super important. And that's really the larger point here. The United Nations plays a vital role in maintaining peace and diplomacy on an international scale. The fact that once a year, representatives from nearly all the countries on Earth, even ones at war with each other, come together to effect real, positive change in the world. The continued existence and power of the UN is a testament to the power of human collaboration. One last side note, if you happen to like the art in this video, you can buy it. I have a DeviantArt account under the name Yours in Distress, where you can purchase prints of this and any of the other artwork that I do. If you would like to talk to me about purchasing the original painting made in this video directly, you can email me. I'll put those links down in the doobly-doo. Thanks for watching.